Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Backlog Banter. My name is Tucker Hazell, and this is Dev Dive, the premier developer interview show on the entire internet. Everyone's so excited about it, and today we've got Ricky Haggett, the creator of many games, but recently Wilmot Works It Out, a fun little puzzle game that we are here to talk about, and also Ricky's career working on a variety of different games. Of course, if you want to play Wilmot Works It Out or any of Ricky's other games, we've got links in the description to the Steam store and other places where you can buy these games. Because I want to make sure that he gets supported here by the people watching this video. But if you are interested in this game, listen to this video and maybe you'll learn a little something about it before. Ricky, thank you very much for joining. You're actually the first person that I've reached out to about an interview, but I've gotten so many done between now and then that you're now like partway through my my interviewing journey. But thank you for just jumping in and be like, hey, this guy that's never done an interview before, I'll talk to him.
Yeah, no worries. Yeah, it's always good to chat about video games.
Yeah, and Wilmot is something that is, I would say, important to me because I played Wilmot's Warehouse on my phone 3 years ago, 4 years ago, something like that, and I love that game. I've always been telling people about it, and so the idea that there was a close to surprise dropped sequel to Wilmot's Warehouse really excited me this year. And I have one question to sort of ease us in: the difference between Wilmot Warehouse and Wilmot Works It Out. Wilmot in the first game is operating a warehouse. He's just a worker. He's on that grind. In this game, he's chilling at home. What happened in Wilmot's life between Wilmot's Warehouse and Wilmot Works It Out to where he's got endless free time?
Well, the game deals with that question kind of obliquely. I don't think I want to go into it really.
Okay, fair enough.
Clearly in the first game, he has a job where he spends a lot of time working in this warehouse. If you play Wilmot's Warehouse, that game has an ending, and I don't want to spoil the ending for people that haven't played the game, but it does have like a definitive ending where something happens. And in this game, yeah, he's at home the whole time. He seems to have a lot of free time on his hands. There's another character, the postwoman Sam, comes and delivers him puzzles. And in doing so, she sort of chats to him. And I feel like in the course of the game, you get some insights into what's going on with Wilmot, but the game never really like explicitly deals with it in a way that was quite deliberate and that I'm quite into. And I I don't want to undermine that sort of feeling of like let the player figure it out for themselves, I think.
Yeah. But I think it's interesting that you added sort of a more active narrative here in Wilmot Works It Out because Wilmot's Warehouse has touches of story sort of in moments and in the posters and little tiny bits of dialogues and things. But having Sam, the postwoman, deliver you these boxes and talk to you pretty consistently and tell you about her life and what's going on in the neighborhood and what's going on in the world and her travels, I thought it was really, really interesting. And Sam tells some stories about conflict and family conflict and struggles that she's going on in her life. And I'm curious, as you were coming up with a narrative about someone talking to someone else, what inspired that sort of narrative to talk about conflict? Were those any of those inspired by things that happened to you, or what went into coming up with that narrative?
The writing of Sam was my main sort of job on this game. Like I did playtesting and I did sort of level design, but sorry, not level design, but like thinking design, like high level, figuring out what the game could be sort of design. But I didn't actually work on it in any other way. I didn't do the programming, and all of the visual art and the sort of deciding what the puzzles were was as Richard Hogg. So yeah, my little bit of like actual work hands on the game was writing Sam. We knew we were going to have this thing of like, oh yeah, she turns up and she gives you a box and she says something. And initially it was just like, oh, it's just like the kind of chats that you have with your postman. People have different relationships with their postman depending on how long they've been in a place usually. When I was a kid, we had a postman who became good mates with us, and would end up like coming around on a Saturday and help my dad like level a floor. It got to the point where we got actually really good mates with them. Other people have especially in London, often have quite a sort of perfunctory, like brisk relationship with their post person. I sketched out a bunch of things that she could say, and it really quickly became clear that like unless we introduced the idea that Wilmot and her had a relationship and were friends to the point where they could discuss some of the things they discuss, then it was just going to be boring, right? Like it's just going to be boring opening the door 70 times and have her just give you some kind of like, bit of like meaningless fluff, nothing conversation. So then I was like, okay, well, we can have some of that feeling of just like, everyday exchanges, but it would be nice to have some stuff which is a little bit more in depth. And then I just made a big list of like what kinds of things could there be. Once we figured out that like the game starts and they're already friends. We don't have this thing of like Sam turns up and introduces herself, and they sort of that I think would feel too much like it would feel hokey. Everything else that came after would feel hokey. Like I think my sense is that they've already been mates for a couple of years. Then that allows you into just discussing stuff that's just more in depth, I suppose.
As I was listening to all the different stories that Sam was telling, and the narrative that she was telling was delving deeper into some things that she was struggling with, her relationship with her sister and wanting to travel and having some stress about these things. I thought there was an interesting cohesion between discussing your issues with someone and working out the problems that you have in a sort of therapy sort of way, and also the puzzle aspect of the game, and the name of the game being Wilmot Works It Out, and of
Yeah,
course Wilmot is working it out in the puzzle sense. You don't really get too much into the mindset of Wilmot. He's a little square little guy,
yeah.
but the narrative is really about working out your feelings with someone and talking about your struggles, and so there's a nice parallel there to that. Did that sort of develop over time as you're like connecting, talking through your problems with puzzles and things like that?
I think it just felt, yeah, it just felt like a good fit. I mean, Wilmot's like Gordon Freeman, right?
Yeah, of course.
Like he has no direct voice himself, really. We only get Sam's side of the conversations, but I think it's sort of implicit that Wilmot is responding in some way. Like she some of the conversations, it's clear that she knows things about what's going on with Wilmot. They clearly have other conversations where you get to, and I think leaving that space for the player allows them to sort of muse on that in a way that's nicely supportive of the fact that you're also doing jigsaws. And then, of course, some of the jigsaws have direct relationships with things that happen in the story. And then when we hit on the idea that, yeah, maybe Sam's also doing the puzzle club, she's
Mhm.
also doing the subscription service, but she's behind. So then she can like give you like responses about things that, and those were very much just like, I played through the whole game. A lot of those puzzles I experienced for the first time properly when they were divided into their seasons. And so very often the things that Sam says about the puzzles were just the things that I felt about when I played those seasons.
I'd be curious to know your involvement with the puzzles. You said that you mostly worked in the game in a testing and writing capacity, but did you have any hand in choosing what the topics of the paintings were going to be, or how the seasons were going to be grouped, or things like that?
Richard Hogg, Dick Hogg, and I have worked together for years and years.
Yeah,
I don't think there's anybody I could imagine better suited for doing the job of coming up with the puzzles than Dick. His illustration style really suits the game. He's so good at like just coming up with fun, silly ideas that are like sort of playful.
yeah,
I'm conscious I don't want to spoil any of the puzzles too
of
much,
course,
but
yeah,
there are just a bunch of just great visual jokes.
totally.
The game is already a game in which you're doing these puzzles and you don't see what they are, and so much of the fun and like the game design is implicit in like you're doing a thing that you don't know what it is, and then there's this aha moment where you figure out, oh, it's that I see. Or sometimes there's multiple aha moments, and sometimes we mix the jigsaws up, so you don't know which puzzles you're even doing, and sometimes what you thought was one puzzle is actually two or three. I was really aware near the start that, like, firstly, I sort of trusted that Dick would do an amazing job of it. Secondly, I really wanted to be able to give feedback on which things were working, which things weren't working. If you know what the puzzles are, you immediately lose the ability to do that. We started off with a bunch of images from Wilmot's Warehouse. The first prototype had we just took a bunch of the Wilmot's Warehouse art, maybe added some background elements to make it work as a puzzle, and then we sort of prototyped a bunch of the game using those. So we had just a feel for like what sorts of things might roughly work. And then really early on, Dick was like, well, yeah, but we need to have proper pictures. Like, it can't just be all these like simple symbols. We have to have proper like jigsaw style pictures. And then from then on, pretty much he just went away and did a bunch of that stuff. And then we would all play test it and give him feedback. And that kind of meant that he was sort of out on a limb. Like it was a bit of a lonely process for him of like, there's a lot of pressure on him to come up with like all of those amazing images. So there was a period where I wrote a document of just like, here's a brain dump of just loads of ideas, some of which he liked but couldn't figure out how to make them work, some of which he liked and sort of did in a straightforward way, and some of which he sort of took the very sort of core of that idea and did something completely different with it in a way that it didn't spoil it for me when I played the game. Even
Fun,
though
yeah.
some of them I was like, oh wow, he did that idea of mine. While I was doing the puzzle, it made no difference. It wouldn't have been helpful information. So yeah, there was throughout the development there was a Miro board of Dick just doing sketches and then working them up into roughs, coloured roughs, and then working them up into final art. And I never saw that board.
Fun. Okay. Yeah. It sounds like this game has a very unique sort of development structure behind it because you're one of the key creatives at your team and you worked extensively on this game, but also you were able to have sort of a player's experience going through the game and experiencing what the primary drive of this game is, as you mentioned, is the aha moment, is the piecing together the final piece that kind of reveals what the joke is. And you're like, oh, that's clever. And then putting up the wall and thinking about it in the context of the other puzzles you've made this season or in the past. I'm curious about the development timeline of this game and what works it out because it is a sequel to Wilmot's Warehouse in the mechanical concept of picking up blocks and moving them around and placing them next to one another. And I'm curious where that idea came from, who had it, when did that happen? When you're making Wilmot's Warehouse or you're thinking about that game, that those mechanics can be reutilized in a different fashion. When did that come about?
We knew that we liked Wilmot as a character. We loved working with Finji, and we knew that there was like community around Wilmot, and you'd see people talking about it. So we knew that there were people out there who liked that guy. It's such a simple set of verbs of like, you're a little square and you can pick up other little squares and rotate them. And it would be weird if there weren't other things that you could do with that set of actions. Before we hit upon the idea of doing these jigsaw puzzles, we did have some other ideas which were more sort of like creative ideas. Like we had the idea that like maybe Wilmot is doing a thing that's more like crafting in Minecraft or Tocker blocks maybe. Like, hey, maybe you can like have him combining abstract symbols to make more complex symbols and gradually build up a kind of, if you play Doodle God, you can sort of combine
Oh,
things.
absolutely. Oh, I love Doodle God. Yeah, yeah,
Yeah,
yeah.
like we had the deal along those lines of like, hey, start off with a few simple elements, and by the end you like made loads of stuff, and then the game is like a kind of sandbox, creative Minecraft world of just
Yeah.
you making stuff. And we started down that path, and quite quickly we were like, it just feels a bit too difficult to like think about what you actually want to do here. It just didn't really spark enough, I think, enthusiasm between the both of us. We're also both massive puzzle fans. We're both jigsaw fans, and we're both specifically fans of doing puzzles without seeing the box.
Oh, fun.
Me more than Dick. He doesn't look at the box, but he'll know what the puzzle is when he's doing it. Whereas I like to do puzzles that I don't know what they are at all. Like I like people when people buy me a puzzle and then just hide the box and just give me the plastic bag with all the pieces in it,
Yeah.
and I never see what it is, and I find out as I'm going. Yeah, I think at some point we just hit on the idea of like, oh, what if it's just he's just like no boxing jigsaws, and then it was really easy to test that because just took the Wilmot's Warehouse code, stripped out all of the sort of Wilmot's Warehouse specific stuff, and then just introduced a way of having the pieces come from bigger images, and it just breaks them into lots of little boxes, and it was really really quick. It took like a week to make a little prototype where we were like, oh yeah, this works, this game. And then we applied for a fund in the UK called the UK Games Fund, and they gave us a little grant to like hire a programmer, and we hired a guy called Talakaya. He also worked on Judero, which came out a few weeks ago. It's a fantastic game with Jack King Spooner. Tala worked on the game for I think about 6 months. There was a big gap, between the first prototype and then when we got the funding, and then Tala kind of came back and did a thing. We would have probably finished maybe 6 months ago, like a bunch earlier, around maybe Christmas last year, but we had to finish Flock. And we were deep in finishing Flock, and Dick was the art director of Flock, and we were just in that last bit of like polishing and tidying, and it's like this is not a good time for Dick to get into drawing a load of, it just felt too stressful. So we ended up just like pausing Wilmot, getting Flock done, and then I was still finishing the end bit of Flock, fixing bugs and dealing with network programming headaches, while Dick was getting started on Wilmot.
Gotcha. Okay. So yeah, that was one of my other questions in terms of developing multiple games at the same time. It sounds like on your end there wasn't too much overlap between working on the
No,
games because there was that pause and because also you weren't doing the programming on that. So I can cut out the how did you balance your work on Flock and Wilmot question that I wanted to ask. Sometimes it's how that works. I mean, the projects might come out close to one another, but your work on them is divided or separated in the actual development timeline. And I'm curious for you in terms of being such a fan of actual puzzles, physical jigsaw puzzles, but also puzzle games being something that's very popular. And I play a lot of puzzle games myself, but not many games combine the idea of puzzle video game mechanics and actually piecing together an image puzzle like a jigsaw. And so, are there any other games that you know of? Because I can't even pull one myself that do sort of a jigsaw puzzle thing, or was this something you sort of felt like this maybe can be done in the digital space?
there are lots of online real jigsaw,
Of
digital
course,
jigsaw
yeah, yeah.
puzzles. There's lots of those, and we actually played quite a lot of those during lockdown. There certainly weren't any direct video game references. It was just like, hey, Wilmot mechanic plus he's doing jigsaws. Like it was pretty straightforward. Early on, there was a big discussion about like, do you allow the pieces to rotate? And we did a bunch of tests, and we were like, no, probably not. At least not yet. Like you could save that for a future game, but definitely it felt like being able to rotate the pieces to any arbitrary rotation was too much of a headache. There was also a lot of work that went into like figuring out how you show when two pieces are connected. Until we hit upon the idea of the pieces have rounded corners when they're not connected, and then when they bolt together, they go solid. It was much harder to understand what was even happening some of the time. So there's a bunch of sort of subtle nuance that we had to figure out about that, which you obviously wouldn't get with it if the puzzle pieces had little notches cut in them and had shapes. The fact that they're squares, I think, actually makes the game harder in a good way, because you only have the images to go on,
Yeah.
and the images are deliberately confusing in colors and have lots of repeated shapes. That it allows you to make puzzles that are hard, even though they've only got like 25 pieces. We really quickly realized with our early sort of tests with the Wilmot art, because you're Wilmot and you literally have to physically pick pieces up and move them around and slide them around, you can't have a puzzle that's like hundreds and hundreds of pieces big, because it's just too time consuming to physically do the moving. So we had to find our difficulty elsewhere, and I think sort of square pieces plus art trickery is where we got that difficulty from.
Yeah, there are, I would say, 3 or 4 very subtle design elements that when I was going into this game, and thinking about, "Okay, I'm going to be interviewing you, I'm gonna have to write questions about this." I was trying to think, "Man, what questions am I gonna ask about, like, how you design these puzzles, the mechanics of it?" And at the beginning, I was like, "This is pretty simple. You pick up the boxes and you put them next to another, and it makes an image." But there are these subtle things that go into making a very, I think, satisfying difficulty curve, and also something that is engaging for the player to start noticing patterns, not only in the puzzles, but also in the way that things are paced out to you, and in the way that the game evolves over time in very, very subtle ways. And the first thing that you notice is that when you are delivered a puzzle box, you don't just get the pieces for one puzzle. You get the pieces for one puzzle and a couple for another that you might not even get to until like the end of the season. And so that, I think, keys you into the fact that you need to be thinking about each set of images or each piece as it could potentially relate to multiple images. And then when that gets started to get combined with the fact that multiple puzzles within any given set or season are similar in their color palette, is really where the trickery comes in, and starts to get more and more confusing as you realize, okay, so this sky gradient is pretty obvious where you can connect to, but it might not connect to this because that's actually for another puzzle that has this similar sky gradient in the background. And so I found it really, really gratifying and satisfying to start noticing these things and having to pay attention even on a deeper level. And I think you're right about it. It's okay, there's squares, but there's a little bit more difficulty because you have to be thinking about things on sort of like a non-linear level. Even if they are just squares, they can be squares that can apply to 2 or maybe even 3 different things in one given season.
Yeah, absolutely. And Dick got much better as time went on. He got better and better at like figuring out some of those tricks.
Yeah.
And right at the end of the game, actually, there were a couple of places where there were a couple of seasons which felt a bit too light, and I was like, "Can you make some new puzzles deliberately designed to confuse
Yeah.
with this puzzle and
Yep.
this puzzle?" And then Dick went and did some of the most amazing things. I think some of my favorite puzzles are just like like they wouldn't exist except to solve a specific problem of being confusing with one of the existing puzzles.
Yeah, and I also think it's fun that, and I'm not exactly sure on the programming side how this works, but when the puzzle pieces come out of the box, they're mixed up, and it is, I think, basically never that the pieces that would connect are like spawned next to another. I don't know, is it random or not the order they come out of the box?
So there's a bunch of stuff we did here. In the original prototype, where we had Wilmot's Warehouse art, that game has a very limited palette. So all our puzzles had like a very small number of colors. And Tala wrote this very clever piece of code, which basically looked at all the colors of all the images and deliberately gave you pieces with the same colors to confuse you. And that felt good, but it was very mean at times. When we started moving to a more like richer illustrative style, that wasn't really possible anymore, because now the colors are a bit more messed up. And so effectively that process had to pass to a more hand scripted thing of like Dick would draw puzzles, and he would already have an idea, and you could just look at the images and go, oh yeah, I can see most of the time what Dick wanted to do to create confusion in this season. And then Pat Ash, our producer, would script that up by figuring out like, well, this one will come first, but then like some of this one and some of this one, and then that will overlap with this one, and like figuring out the sort of big beats of like what the set list is going to be for the season. And then we hit upon this idea of like semi-scripting the pieces, because sometimes you want a piece strictly to be delivered before another piece. Like sometimes it's really important that like let's give them the pieces on the left hand side of the jigsaw first before the pieces on the right.
Sure.
And
Yeah.
for other puzzles it's like, well, we don't really mind too much, but maybe we just want this piece to be the last piece. And so what we have is, for every puzzle in the game there is a same size image with a grid, and every square in that image is just a different scale of grey from white to black. And if you make it fully white, it means deliver this piece first. And if you make that piece black, it means deliver this piece last. And if you make it any scale of grey between, it means use the amount of greyness to determine the randomness, but it can still, you know what I mean? So you basically end up with like a kind of way of tuning which pieces arrive so that it's still kind of random. Every time you play it, it'll be kind of random, but you'll always get the pieces that we've set to be the first or last pieces first or last, if that makes sense.
Yeah, yeah. And another element of the way that the squares, the puzzle piece squares are designed is that they're divided in interesting ways. And this, I guess, is probably a question for Dick, but you might be able to answer it in terms of what went into making sure that on the grid it was satisfyingly divided into equal squares, where it was a puzzle to figure out how does this connect. And it's certainly ones where lines are crossing and patterns are crossing. There are moments where there's just a touch of something that hints that you can connect it to something else. And that was always fun for me to be thinking about it in terms of dividing it into a grid, making sure just a little bit of an edge hints into another one to indicate that you can connect them together. I'm sure that was a very interesting process to go through, and I'm not sure what your involvement was with that, but anything would be fun.
I can answer the question. Dick drew all the puzzles, the final art for the puzzles, with the template of a grid on top. He had a grid, an overlay in Photoshop or Procreate, where you had the overlay of the each of the rounded pieces all tiled outwards, and you end up with these little diamonds in at the intersections, and you just had to make sure that you are not allowed to ever put anything important to the puzzle in those diamonds.
Oh yeah, where it's going to get rounded off. Yeah.
Yeah, and he would also make sure that like if two pieces are adjacent and there would be confusion about where they could go together, to make sure to give you enough material that joins the gap. So for example, there are stars in the game. There's a couple of puzzles which have a starry sky, black and white spots. And those pieces have stars which bridge the gaps of the puzzle divides and let you, it's subtle and it's tricky, but it gives you something to go on rather than just randomizing. One of the things that I asked for a few times is like, hey, could this puzzle be a bit bigger or a bit smaller? And you think it would be trivial, but obviously it means it's not just scaling the puzzle up. You have to scale the puzzle up, then you have to put it on the grid that's slightly bigger, and then you have to go through every single piece and be like, is this still okay everywhere?
It's a deceptively simple design process, and I think that that's kind of what was satisfying about like thinking about this game on a design level, is noticing those small things. And I'm curious for you, being so intimately familiar with this game, are there any little design touches in art direction or game design that people might not notice? I've got a couple of small things myself that I found very fun. I like how when a box is opened, Wilmot's face sort of shifts direction as he's like looking at the pieces filter out into the environment. I thought that was a really cool way to add a little bit of personality to him. And I also like how the last season reuses some of the musical motifs of Wilmot's Warehouse. I've played that game so many times, and the music is largely totally different in this one. But as I was listening to the music of the last season, I'm like, I'm noticing some of these tiny little things that make me remind me of Wilmot's Warehouse. So those are a couple small things that I liked. But are there any things that you think people might not notice about this game?
I mean, I think the music is a good one to talk about here. Like Ellie Rainsbury's soundtrack is amazing, and yeah, it definitely was like it was for sure inspired by Wilmot's Warehouse. Like we knew we didn't want to like go too far from that. I was astonished to the extent to which they made every season have different music, but it sort of changes subtly over time. So every season, it's like it's a bit different now, and it slowly morphs and evolves over time in a way that's very satisfying. Other than that, I think there's just lots of little juice and timing on everything. Sometimes I feel like, oh, am I being too fussy here? Like, but just like changing the subtle timings of things just makes such a big difference in a way that's kind of intangible. It's very hard to justify those sorts of things. They're just sort of an intuition about things, of like timings of like how long should it take when you push a box for every, when Wilmot pushes into things, how long should it take for the initial one to happen, and then what should the repeat time be, stuff about how the cursor moves around. It's not like earth-shatteringly like like, oh my, and there's this thing you won't have spotted that's just this amazing thing. It's just more like lots of tiny little subtle things about how the game feels that all just add up to it just being you kind of want it to be intrinsically fun. If you can make it so that just the act of doing the individual second to second actions just feels really nice and fun, then that really smooths out a lot of the rest of the experience, I suppose. Just takes pressure off everything else.
Yeah, and I'm sure that those small design decisions are a little bit easier to work into reality working with as small a team as you guys do. Working with one programmer, you as the writer, the artist, the composer. I mean, if you had to go through a whole chain of command in order to shift the timing of the boxes and things, I'm sure that would that would drive you crazy. But I think it's really cool what you guys do with a small team, being able to diversify your catalog in such an interesting way. I believe I played most of your games. I played Hohokum, I played I Am Dead, I played Flock, Wilmot's Warehouse, and Wilmot Works It Out. And so those are, except for the Wilmot games, those are all totally different in design. And I'm just curious for you in your career, do you always like to be moving on to something else? Of course, Wilmot sort of an exception to that, but totally different genres of games. Do you like that variety? You get creative energy out of that?
I think we're always just trying to find things that people haven't explored, maybe. I guess it's like you want to make things because you want them to exist and they don't exist. Yeah, Wilmot was a bit of an exception just because, yeah, like we just liked that guy, and we were just could see that there was like appetite, and it just felt like when we tried out a little prototype, I think that's the first time we've ever made something that's like based on another thing exactly. You're only alive on this planet for so long, and you only get to make so many things. Personally, I feel like why would I want to spend time making a thing that somebody else has already made? It was fun making the board game as well. Yeah, there was a time early this year where we were like working on Wilmot Works Out, and I was finishing on Flock, and we were also finalizing the last bit of the design stuff on the board game, and that was a bit like, I've maybe got too many things on my plate here. This is a bit much, but it was only for like a month that it was really properly hectic. And yeah, working on that game was so nice, and it was such a nice counterpoint from like dealing with video game things, to dealing with just like cardboard and just words on a card, and finalizing the artwork, and like what should the back of the box look like, and all of that kind of just much more grounded stuff. I think was just a really lovely design thing to work on. I'd love to work on more like tabletop physical board game, card game things. I think if the opportunity came up, I'd be up for
Yeah,
that.
and being combined with Dick Hog's art automatically makes those sort of stand out. And I've yet to pick up the board game myself, but I was very excited when I saw that, and it did clue me in, that announcement of that, and then the announcement of Wilmot Works It Out, that you guys did have quite a lot on your plate. I'm curious for you in terms of working on these projects, especially the games, sort of concurrently, and then releasing actually very close together. What goes into making the choice of when to announce a game and how far ahead of time to reveal it? Because Flock was revealed almost 2 years before it came out, and then Wilmot Works Out was given 3 months, maybe 4 months until announcement to release. So what went into that decision of very different timescales in terms of announcement to release?
Well, Flock was a Game Pass game, and we worked with Annapurna on that, and I think we just like were looking for opportunities to do the sort of key beats of like tease the game first, and then sort of announce the game more properly, more fully, about explain a lot more about it, and have a playable, and then announce the date. Those were our three key beats for Flock. And I think we were just like looking for opportunities to be in big enough showcases that would get enough eyeballs. I think it was broadly just a sort of business decision of like, what have we got that we could show that's polished enough that will build some excitement over time. With Wilmot Works It Out, we just simply didn't have anything to show until quite near the end. We prototyped it, we figured it all out, we proved it was going to be a fun game. Then we were waiting for Dick to be able to make real art for it. And then once he started doing real art from it, it was just quite an intense process of like, 4 months of just making the game and then releasing it. So I don't think there was necessarily the opportunity to have like a big long campaign. And also I don't know if it would have needed that.
The more trailers you have, the more puzzles you show, the less there is to surprise people in the game.
Yeah, and the more time you have to spend making that stuff, right, and doing that work. Obviously, Finji and Annapurna both did a bunch of work to figure out a sensible release date that wasn't like, at the same time as Nintendo release a new Zelda game or something.
Yeah.
There's definitely things you want to avoid. Is mostly what it's about, and just choosing times which seem likely to be like for the kinds of people you want to talk to about your game, a bit more empty. Not the calendar is now full all year round, but
Of
it's just a
course.
case of choosing your battles of like, what do you want to go up against here? So there's a bit of thinking in that sense, but
I am also curious in terms of releasing the game and deciding which platforms it's going to be on, because as of now, Wilmot Works Out is on Steam, and I played it on my Steam Deck, and it's phenomenal on there. You don't have to talk about like if there's future platforms planned, but I'm curious in the decision making process as the game is being designed. What goes into choosing which platforms this will be on? Because Flock launched on a number of things. Wilmot's Warehouse launched on Switch and mobile, and of course Steam and Xbox and PlayStation. But as of now, Wilmot Works It Out is only on Steam, and so what went into the decision of like not putting it on consoles at launch?
the general feeling is like if you release your game on Steam, then you have a good sense of like whether there's going to be appetite for console launches. I think it's fairly likely we do other platforms, but we don't have any super solid plans to do any right now. But I think it's just like the other thing is releasing the Steam version is a really good way to like build a kind of groundswell of people who are like, the first people to play it and then tell us stuff about it, and then we can like, decide what makes sense to do after that. And it's so much easier maintaining
One platform.
well, PC and Mac, right? There's two,
Yeah.
but yeah,
Oh, sure.
yeah, so much easier doing that than the every time you update your game, you now have to update it on Switch and PlayStation and Xbox. With Flock, I think there's just like, well, we had a porting studio help us with the ports,
Oh, okay.
and so if you've got a porting studio helping you with the ports and they have a block of work to do, then it makes sense to do PlayStation and Xbox. And we had to do, we did Xbox because we were on Game Pass for Flock, so different sort of setup, I suppose. Whereas with Wilmot, it's such a small team that it makes sense to just get the first platforms done and then take stock and decide what to do next.
Yeah, it reminds me in a way of how sometimes films will release in limited release, and they'll build up a little bit of conversation. They'll release in more theaters, and then of course you get the theatrical release. Then inspires people to check it out on streaming as it comes out, and then buy it for purchase on VOD. And so games I'd never really thought of in that way of building up a conversation and momentum, but it does make sense of Steam being sort of the most accessible platform to put it out there first, and then hopefully inspire people to talk about it and get them to build up buzz for future system releases. So yeah, absolutely makes
Yeah,
sense.
yeah, exactly.
And the last thing that I want to talk about is the marathon mode that you unlock when you finish the game for the first time, which is almost an entirely different game, frankly. And I think it's really, really fascinating that you include this secondary mode at the end. And for people who haven't played the game or haven't unlocked it yet, maybe this will inspire you to play the game all the way through and then play it again. You unlock marathon mode, which is Wilmot is in a much bigger room, in a much bigger environment, and all the puzzle pieces are delivered in sequence. You can pick them up and open them up at once, and it's as far as I know, it's all the puzzles just sort of mixed together. And it's crazy. I mean, it's an insane inversion on the focus of the original game, but it also kind of mixes it with Wilmot's Warehouse, which is much more about that open environment and organizing it yourself. So I thought that was fascinating, but also it's so much harder. I mean, it's so much harder. And so what went into designing it in that way? Was it inspired by Wilmot's Warehouse in terms of combining the things together? Have you completed marathon mode? I mean, I just have a lot of questions about that one mode in particular.
Yeah. So it came in relatively late. We were relatively close to the end, and we knew that we hadn't properly talked about whether there would be a new game plus mode where some things would be randomized. And I think we had a meeting like a few months before launch. And I was just like, hey, what if we did a mode where it just delivers you just get every box after box of just any random piece from any of the puzzles. And Tala was basically like, yeah, we can make that happen. We can try that. The first thing he did was just give me a mode where the room is way bigger. Because at this point we were like, will this be fun or will this just be miserable?
Yeah. It would be miserable in that small of a room in the initial size. Yeah.
It'd be impossible. It would be completely impossible. Yeah, so we started off with just, hey, make the room way bigger, like way bigger than we even need it to be, and let's just let the player have their hand on the pedal of, like, because you can take a delivery of 25 random pieces, sort them out completely, and then get another one, or you can get multiple. It's up to you, right? How quickly you want to fill the warehouse with random stuff. So yeah, I got Tyler to give me that version, and there was no control on the randomness. The initial version was full randomness across any of the pieces, and just the question was just like, is this going to be fun at all? And I played it for about 3 or 4 hours, and there were two conclusions. One, this is, yes, already really fun. Two, it would be more fun if there was a little bit more steering. We called it steering. It's just like, basically there's just a very small random element of, like, hey, let's give them pieces which will help them finish puzzles. Dick really wanted to put in a bunch of bonus puzzles from Wilmot's Warehouse because he thought
Oh,
that'd be a
yeah.
nice thing to do, and I think that's a really smart decision. So there's like an extra 16 puzzles in
Oh,
marathon mode,
okay.
just to kind of mess with you, just to give you stuff that's like you've never
Sure.
seen before. But that's a lot of puzzles, right? That's like nearly 100 puzzles, and if you are juggling all the pieces for a full 100 puzzles in the room, it starts to get a little bit sort of demoralizing in the sort of halfway to 2/3 of the way through point, where, like, in theory, just based on the random draw, you could have a lot of puzzles unfinished, and the more you have unfinished, the harder it is to navigate through, like Wilmot's Warehouse, right? And you want a bit of that, but you do also want some of the puzzles to go up on the wall to give you some space. And every time in marathon mode you get to put a puzzle on the wall, you're like, oh, thank God, there's a bit more space now, and I can. So yeah, consequently, the game does a little bit of steering to help you finish off puzzles with its piece selection. And then the only other tweak we made was to make the room the right size. We started off with a room that was too big, then we made it smaller, but it was a bit too small, and then we made it a little bit bigger, I think was the order. So I played the game through fully twice, and I played it through like maybe about halfway through once. And then all the Finji QA folks and our producer Pat played it through, and so yeah, we had a bunch of people playing it through to the point where we knew. And yeah, I was so happy at how quickly it came together comparatively. Like, it's quite a scary thing to do. It's like, are we really going to ship this thing in like less than 6 weeks? But Tyler was like, I think it'll be fine, and I think it is essentially fine. And yeah, it's so nice that it's like a mode that, like, properly for people who love Wilmot's
Oh,
Warehouse.
of course. Yeah.
Like, it's for true Wilmot heads, and I love seeing people's reaction to it. I think it's totally reasonable for people to get to it and just go, no, this isn't for me. I think it totally had to be a mode that would only unlock after you've finished the main game, because you have to have seen the jigsaws first.
Sure.
You have to know what the puzzles are, and even once you've seen them all, it's still pretty hard. Like, like I'd say 2/3 of the pieces you pretty much know what puzzle they're from, but a third of them you're just like, I don't know. I just ended up with like a slush pile in the corners of just like random bits. I've got no idea what puzzle they're from. And some of them came back to bite me multiple times. It's like, I still haven't remembered what this weird orange square is. Like, what is that from?
Yeah, yeah. Or it might be from one of the ones you've never seen, which is
Yeah,
interesting because
totally.
I don't know, I'm probably 1 or 2 hours into a marathon mode, and there's a bunch of stuff that I'm like, I can't tell. There's no way to tell, because there's also, it's interesting to think about in the context of all the puzzles being together, how many pieces there really are that are largely blank or largely unidentifiable, unless they're in the context of being close to other pieces that carry that pattern forward. And so you get something that's half orange, half yellow, and you're like, that could go with 7 different things. Yeah, who knows? But you're right that it is kind of a nice cherry on top of, if you are really dedicated to this, of course, it's possible to. It's something that I will probably pick at over time, trying to eventually get that. But the final thing, just to close things out, I'm curious for you, as someone who's making games, and enjoys the medium. Are there any games that you're currently playing that you're enjoying, or any smaller games you think maybe people haven't heard of that you want to recommend people check out, or anything like that?
Yeah, my favorite game I think this year, or certainly my favorite game that I've played properly this year, is Grun.
Oh, I am talking to Tom in about 2 weeks,
Yay!
so I haven't played it yet, but I'll let him know that you enjoyed it.
You're in for a treat. It's one of those games that I wish I could have my memory erased so I could figure it all out again. It's so dense and ornate with secrets, and it's so intricate and clever. I really loved it, and the atmosphere's perfect. I've been playing it with my son actually. He's 12, and he's just like really getting into my Steam games library. He's
Oh,
just
of
like
course.
really exploring like stuff, and it's been one of the games that he and I have both sort of been playing in parallel, and then we'll like share tips, and then we'll like sit next to each other and help each other with a particular run to like solve a particular thing.
Very cool. I don't know if you've played it, but my favorite game of this year is also a puzzle game, and it's called Lorelei and the Laser Eyes from Annapurna and Simogo. It's the most insane puzzle game I've ever played. I think it's one of the most clever puzzle games I've ever played. It's one of the kind of games where it encourages you to write things down physically, which I hadn't really done before. But it totally put me in a different mindset. And I've got just pictures of, I don't know if it'll focus there, but of just like
Oh
all my
yeah, great.
notes of different puzzles and different icons, and you've got like seasons of the moon and like Latin and Roman numerals and stuff. And so if you have a mind for puzzles and also like sort of isometric Resident Evil style aesthetic, I think it's a phenomenal game, and I think it's gotten criminally underplayed. So that's a hearty recommendation for me of puzzle games this year.
Yeah, I need to go back and play it. I think that game came out when I was still deep in Flockland.
Yeah, that makes sense. Thank you very much for coming up with this idea, for delivering on it, for making a great game that I really recommend people check out. Of course, again, links to purchase the game in the description. I'll also, I guess, leave a link to Flock and Wilmot's Warehouse and your other games. But Ricky, thank you very much for joining me.
Thanks, Tucker. That was great.